What's going on, guys, and welcome to today's video. And today we've got the TRX, and hopefully with the help of Rogue Off-Road, we are going to get the nose a little bit more level. Now, obviously what we're talking about is a leveling kit. Now we're going to kind of talk about the good leveling kits and the bad leveling kits here before we jump into it, because there are basically two different types of leveling kits that you'll find out there. And the first one is a bolt-on spacer that goes on top of the shock and spring. This is typically the cheapest leveling kit that you'll find, and not even just TRX specific, but just any truck or independent suspension truck. You're going to find a cheap $100 spacer that bolts on top of the shock and spring package, and it does that. It lifts and levels the front of the truck, but that is not necessarily the correct or the best way to do it, because when you are doing that, you are adding more length or down travel to the suspension. You're going to be putting your ball joints in a bind, your CV shafts in a bind. I've seen a lot of really bad things with bolt-on style spacers at the shop. So don't even think about that. Let's talk about the correct option, and that is a preload spacer. Now, a preload spacer goes in between the shock and spring assembly. You take it apart and the spacer goes on, and it adds preload to the spring, but you aren't really adding any down travel to the suspension, or you're not adding overall length to the suspension. So you're going to keep your ball joints happy, you're going to keep your CV shafts happy. All of that factory geometry is still kept intact with a preload spacer. Now, what I chose to go with on my personal truck here is Rogue Off-Road's offering, and it is a really cool kit because there are actually about 3 different heights you could have the front set to. I've got a shock here in the bed of the truck. We will bring you guys around, and I'll kind of show you all of the configurations that we can choose from. So guys, like I said, this is Rogue Off-Road's front leveling kit for the TRX, and it's adjustable basically because you've got 3 different positions. Now, first would just be this preload spacer itself, and with just the preload spacer installed, you're going to be looking at 1 inch to 1.25 inch lift on the front of the truck. Now, secondly, we do have a top mount or top hat spacer, but this is not a bolt-on spacer that's 3 inches thick and going to be causing a bunch of issues. This is a very thin spacer in the overall scheme of suspension. But Rogue Off-Road found out that this is about the max preload you want to run, and this is a safe, acceptable, top spring mount spacer that keeps everything still happy but gives you a little bit more lift. So with a combination of both of these, you're looking at 1.7 to 1.8 inches of lift in the front with both of these. And then kind of third would just be your top spacer. If you just wanted to run that, you're looking at roughly, 1/4 inch to 0.3 inches or so with just that top mount spacer. Now, one thing I do like on the kind of fit and finish or quality of these is the anodizing here is basically factory finish here. Now, guys, how many other TRX guys out there are going to have a spare Blackhawk E2 shock laying in the back of their truck? But I've got this just so I can show you guys this cool leveling kit. Now, if you haven't seen, and you probably haven't, this is what our front Bilstein Blackhawk E2 shocks are. And it is a really cool full aluminum body. You've got aluminum spring seats, and you've obviously got our remote reservoir with our braided stainless hose for our reservoir. You've got a lot of electronics too. You've got a connector here with our dual bypass valves. It's a very cool shock. Now, what Rogue Off-Road did is obviously that first preload spacer. Now we're going to take a 6mm Allen and take our bolts out. Obviously, you're going to do this after you get your suspension out of the vehicle. But again, guys, I'm just kind of showing you what this thing looks like on the shock itself. Now, you'd remove your shock, and you would then put it on a spring compressor, take that off, and then we're going to just lift that lower spring seat, install Rogue Off-Road's preload spacer, and obviously bolt it back together. But that's kind of that final product here. is their preload spacer bolted together underneath the factory spring seat. Now, they've really done their work. I don't know if you guys can see or not, but there is a factory little notch around this plug in the shock body. Of course, Rogue Off-Road has it all milled out perfectly, so it's still going to locate the spring seat. It's not going to turn and twist or do weird things. It's going to be as OEM as possible, but just with a little more preload. Now, like we said, that is the preload spacer. The top mount spacer, I don't have the top mount on, but that will just go right on top of the mount and slide the assembly back into the truck and have your 1.7 to 1.8 inches of lift in the front. Or like we said, without that, you'll have your 1 inch to 1.2 inches of lift with just the preload spacer. Now again, with just that top mount in place, you'll have roughly a 1/2 inch or so of lift. So guys, down in the description, there is going to be a link to Rogue Off-Road. You can click on their website and go to the TRX section, go to suspension. He's got a lot of cool products, but this is one of them that I was really excited about to get on my personal truck. So of course, go check out his website. Now let's get this thing into the shop. I don't know how detailed I'm going to be on the teardown. I think I will throw the link to the video up here that I did relatively recently on that full kind of detailed suspension teardown, every nut and bolt, the size, all of that. But I think we'll at least show getting our spacers on, getting them back in the truck, and kind of that process. So again, let's get in the shop, let's get this thing on, and let's get the front of the truck a little bit higher. All right guys, so I obviously saved you the long video of me tearing apart the suspension. We already did that in a really kind of good detailed video that again, I will link up here that will show you step by step how to get the front suspension or front shock and spring assembly out of your TRX. But once you've got that, I've got it laying here on the cart. And now we can kind of get a really good look at the Rogue Off-Road kit. Now for today, I think I am just going to throw the preload spacer on and leave the top plate off. That'll give me a little adjustability down the road if I decide I want to lift the nose of the truck up more. But you guys with aftermarket heavy bumpers or the winch bumpers that are out there, this would be a really good option to be able to perfectly dial in how much lift you've got on the front of that truck. Heavier bumper, big huge winch, add everything. If you just have the factory stuff, you can just kind of pick and choose how much lift you want to do, and that's why I really like this Rogue Off-Road kit, and that's why it's going on my truck personally. Once you're on a spring compressor, you are going to compress the spring enough to where you can get these preload spacers slid into place. And on the very front, there is a little notch like we talked about that will fit into the factory plug or bolt here on the Bilstein shocks. We'll then get our hardware installed. And honestly, that's one of the cool things about this preload spacer is that it's two-piece. You don't have to fully disassemble the shock and spring assembly. You can just leave it together, compress it enough, get it installed, and you're done. And just like that, you've got the lower preload spacer installed. Obviously, you'll throw it back on the truck, you'll do the other side, but that's it. There's no massive disassembly of the shock and spring. It's all staying together. You're compressing the spring, putting the preload spacer on, and you're done. Now, like I said, the previous video shows all of that disassembly, but man, this is easy. Once you're on a spring compressor, you can get that preload spacer in there. So I'm gonna go ahead and get the other side thrown on, and I'll get it on the ground, and then we'll see where this thing sits. Well guys, here it is, all leveled out with Rogue Off-Road, and I just took it for a kind of a short drive around the block, down the highway and back, just to kind of settle everything and feel everything out. And Man, I honestly really like the way it drives or rides. With that preload spacer, we're adding just a little bit more preload to that front spring, which honestly these trucks need. With as much nosedive as we have while braking and turning, that little bit of added preload adds a little bit of spring stiffness to that front suspension. And man, even under hard braking, that truck just feels a lot more stable, not as much nosedive, and it kind of feels like it should have felt from the factory. Now, how it sits, I got about 1.25 inches right as advertised with just that lower preload spacer installed. So I don't know, I'm gonna kind of keep an eye on it, see how it sits or settles. It shouldn't really settle anything because we've got a aluminum spacer with our factory springs. But if in the future, if I've got some big heavy bumper or an aftermarket bumper, I can always add that top plate if I want to get a little more height out of the front. And again, guys that are running different rear springs or whatever, you could always add that top plate to add just a little bit more height to the front of your truck. Now, obviously, after the preload spacers are installed, you are going to need an alignment. You're gonna have to do that. I threw the truck up on the alignment rack after I got the preload spacers done, because anytime you lift or lower or do anything to an independent suspension vehicle in the front, your camber, caster, toe, they're all going to be slightly out of spec. So you do not want to destroy your tires. So just plan on getting an alignment after the truck is done. Now, one kind of TRX specific thing is going and having the ride height sensors calibrated. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of people that haven't done this and the truck's been perfectly fine, but with our TRXs, we've got ride height sensors at all 4 corners. It would kind of be advisable after the truck has been lifted and the alignment's been done to have those ride height sensors calibrated at a level or flat ground position. That just kind of relearns those sensors so it knows this is how the truck sets at, you know, ride height. So when it's jumping or when it's landing or doing whatever, those ride height sensors know exactly where that truck is in its suspension travel. And as far as I know, the only way to do that is at a dealership. So hopefully you've got a good relationship with your selling dealer or your local dealer, and you can run in there, and yeah, they may charge you, you know, a half hour of labor or something, but it's gonna help the truck with all of our awesome, cool electronic ride and dampening to have the truck know where it's at in the suspension travel. So again, hopefully you've got a good relationship with your dealer and can get that taken care of. So guys, I think that kind of covers it. Obviously this wasn't a crazy in-depth suspension teardown because we've got another video for that, but this shows you kind of the assembly, at least, of that preload spacer from Rogue Off-Road. And if you'd like your own, there'll be a link down in the description for rogueoffroad.com. Go check them out, get your preload spacers ordered, and get your truck looking a lot better, because mine obviously does. So guys, as always, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time.